This is how today's anti-war protests stack up against major student movements in history. Campus protests for Gaza might be the biggest of the 21st century. Um, for a moment, I thought that was somebody in a PVC suit, but that's not the case. Alrighty then. So this is Nicole Naria, covers politics and society for VOX. She first joined VOX in 2019, and her work has also appeared in Politico, Washington Monthly, and the New Republic. Quickly go to the comment. Will says, I'm against simping for anyone. That said, I do have a Yemeni flag. I wrote on it Heroes of the Red Sea in Arabic because when times are hard, you need hope no matter how imperfect. Fair enough. It has taken, my mic volume has taken a dip. Okay. Thank you for letting me know. I think I lowered it a little bit too much. I had asked earlier. Is that better? I think that's better now. I think you're going to say that it is. So, protests against the war in Gaza have spread to college campuses across the country in the days since students at Columbia University were arrested last week, evoking images of historical student protests that were met with similar backlash. Thank you for letting me know, guys. Thank you. Recent protests have not yet reached the scale of the major student protests of the late 60s against the Vietnam War or the 1980s against South African apartheid. But on campus, they may be the largest student movement so far of the 21st century, said Robert Cohen, a professor of social studies and history at New York University. Okay, just like the protesters that came before them, the students who are now being arrested and in some cases suspended for setting up encampments on their campuses in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza have been demonized by politicians. Will has to go. Thank you, Serena. You're awesome, even in the way you interact with your community and guide it to a more friendly, humane dynamic. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thanks for letting me know about the mic as well. But have a good one, Will. I'll see you on the other side. So, just like the protesters that came before them, the students who are now being arrested and in some cases suspended for setting up encampments on their campuses in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza have been demonized by politicians. The vast majority are peaceful protesters who have been overshadowed by a minority of bad actors, some potentially not even affiliated with universities where these demonstrations are taking place. So I know that there'll be plenty of pushback to that. The pushback will probably be that this line, the vast majority are peaceful and is overshadowed by a minority of bad actors. I think the problem there is that I'm sure there's some kind of scientific measure of this, but let's just say you have a stretch of a protest and the bad actors are there, right? The impact of the bad actors on that stretch of the protest will be what? It might not sort of convert the sentiment of the entire protest, but what kind of impact is that going to have on those around? Now, you've got to detach yourself from the issue and the cause because let's say the protest was supporting something that you didn't agree with. And then there was an extreme sort of faction part of that protest, sort of like whatever stretch of protesters that were having an influence, that were having was having an impact. So I don't know, like I'd probably push back on that line as well because I'm kind of getting a little bit tired of it. I feel as if then we're kind of going round and round and round and round, and then it's just keeping us all distracted with the round and round and round and round commentary, and we don't really get anywhere. Okay, so some of their demands, including divestiture from firms that support Israel's war and occupation, mirror demands that past protesters made to divest from South Africa's apartheid government, and their discontent has similarly intensified in the face of police crackdowns. But there are key differences as well. Besides their smaller size, the present day protests have faced swifter suppression than their predecessors dealt with. In perhaps the most extreme example, at the University of Texas Austin, administrators quickly dispatched police with horses and riot gear, absent any sign of violence at Palestinian protests. Okay. Charges were later dropped against all 57 arrested, and that signals a what is going on? Deterioration of schools' commitment to protecting free speech that emerged in the 1960s. So the point was that there seems to be much swifter suppression than there was before. Here's a quote. I think that the fact that this has happened so quickly is unprecedented, and the call for suppression of speech is much more public. That is for sure. And again, if we go back to the point of the protests then become not much less, but more about the fact that they're being restricted to have their voice heard. Aristotle says, how long can the protests go on for? In reality, do we have to spend our whole lives with this? Well, I think if things are going to continue in the way that they will, and they will in the Middle East, I think that things are constantly going to do this kind of like there'll be this constant shifting of conflicts and tensions, and humanitarian crises, that there'll always be something for people to march about. I think we'll see, and then there'll be counter protests, and then there'll be others who feel that this is a great way to get attention, because it is. In one way, you have to argue it is, and then it will give them motivation to also either put together local actions or more national ones. I think the way the world is going, until it's more fair and just, we're just going to get more of this. These protests are only getting started, back to the VOX piece, and it's too early to tell just how large they might get before classes let out for the summer. But the opposition they faced from their inception could make it harder to build the kind of momentum their predecessors had and to achieve their goals. What today's protests do and don't have in common with the anti-war protests of the 1960s. Columbia students famously occupied university buildings in 1968 in protest against segregation and the Vietnam War before the police forcibly removed them. They wanted Columbia to end the construction of a segregated gymnasium nearby in Morningside Park and to cut ties with the Institute for Defense Analysis, which was researching weapons development for the US government's war effort. This all happened against a backdrop of broader anti-war and anti-racism protests across the US, both on and off campuses, that helped energize the student movement. Student protests swept college campuses in the 1960s, involving thousands of students and hundreds of universities. Those protests remain the biggest in history. The current protest movement is clearly growing, but it's nowhere near that scale, said Angus Johnson, an adjunct professor at the City University of New York studying student protests. The tactics employed by protesters in the 1960s were also vastly different. Okay. While many started and remained peaceful, at their most extreme, students rioted, barricaded themselves in buildings, fought with police, burned down ROTC buildings, and raided draft boards to steal or destroy files. They culminated in the Kent State Massacre in 1970, when members of the Ohio National Guard shot at a crowd of unarmed student protesters, killing 4 and injuring 9. The recent protests, on the other hand, have not gone anywhere near as far. What we are seeing in this spring's wave of protest is students who are not engaging in property damage. They are not, for the most part, occupying buildings. They are certainly not initiating physical altercations on any large-scale level, Johnson said. In the late 60s, what we were seeing was protests that were much more aggressive in their tactics than the ones that we're seeing today. What do you make of those points? Anyone seen Hairspray? Aristotle says they showed the protests at that time. And Hashem says the Israeli PM is the biggest cause of the war not stopping. And also something about during Nixon's era. Okay, cool. So some students vocally opposed these tactics in the 1960s. Notably, Donald Trump's former Attorney General Bill Barr was among a group of Columbia students known as the Majority Coalition, who banded together to defend the university buildings from protesters and were incensed that they could not attend class. Student opposition to today's protests has highlighted anti-Semitic incidents at or around some protests, raising concerns about their safety. You have to be an absolute waste man if you are taking any opportunity to protest to be absolutely hateful and violent towards anyone. Like, what is the point? Go home, get a hobby. Like, seriously? It's just so dumb. I know I'm sort of like trivializing it, but I'm serious. Like, people. For instance, one student at Columbia wrote an op-ed in Haaretz with the headline "Jewish students are no longer safe at Columbia University." He wrote that a masked student on campus showed him a Hamas insignia and said he was with them, and that another protester near campus shoved him against a wall. Just dumbasses, like, seriously. Aristotle says, we need Trump back. Hashem says, the major anti-war protests against the Vietnam War and the Kent State University incident happened during Richard Nixon's era. Um, Headwork says, yeah, people. Yeah, you know what I mean? It's like, come on, get a hobby. One of the weapons that can be used now by students who don't like what's happening around them to say, I don't feel safe, I'm scared, said Daniel Farber, a history professor at the University of Kansas who has studied American activism. I think that certainly didn't occur in the 1960s. Okay. One way today's protests resemble those of the 60s, however, is that they've escalated when university administrators have sent in the police to break them up. Both now and then, students who did not participate in the initial or more racial elements of the protests resented being characterized as confrontational and disruptive. If you treat everybody like they're radical militants who are out to do violent misdeeds, you tend to get what you characterize, said Farber. It radicalized protesters in the 60s. It made them angrier. It didn't make them go away. That's something to think about. Okay? If you treat everybody like they're radical militants who are out to do violent misdeeds, you tend to get what you characterize. You tend to get what you characterize. I like that a little bit too much. I like it. Politicians also sought to capitalize on the backlash to the protests of the 60s, just as some are now. In the 1966 California governor's race, former President Ronald Reagan accused the incumbent governor and the president of the University of California of not being tough enough on protesters at Berkeley, even though they conducted a mass arrest of students. Reagan got elected governor by pledging to clean up the mess of Berkeley, Cohen said. If that sounds familiar to today, you're not wrong. Republican Speaker of the House Mike Johnson took a similar tack and visited Columbia's campus Wednesday to demand that the university president resign for not being strict enough with the protesters, even though she had just called the police on protesters. His party, meanwhile, continues to wage war on elite universities that it accuses of promoting woke ideas. Is anyone else fed up of this term woke? Just so fed up of it. Today's protests have a lot in common with anti-apartheid protests of the 1980s. A better analogy for today's protests might be the anti-apartheid protests of the 80s. Students built up their power in university governance and assembled lobbying groups throughout the 70s. They also became more of a political force when the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18 in 72. That meant that by the time protests against South African apartheid gained steam in the 80s, they had accumulated more political influence and were better organized. Their demands of university administrations were practically identical to what protesters are asking for today. They wanted their universities to divest from firms that supported or profited from South African apartheid. And they were effective. 155 universities ultimately divested. And in 1986, the US government also bowed to pressure from protesters and enacted a divestment policy. Along with increasing protests, well, it's not going to happen now, is it? It's just not. Let's call a spade a spade. It's just not going to happen, okay? It's the US, it's Israel, it's all of that that's going on geopolitically. It's just not going to happen. Okay. Along with increasing protests within South Africa, led by organizations including the African National Congress, The Pan-Africanist Congress and trade unions, that kind of international pressure helped force the white South African government to begin negotiations that ultimately ended apartheid, at least officially. But protesters also didn't face much pushback in the 80s because there was a certain embarrassment among elites in the US that there was complicity with South Africa's white government, Faber said. It was kind of pushing against an open door, he said. It wasn't really a polarizing issue. We have, how does this make, okay, another comment, sorry. That differs from today when the Gaza war has revealed a major generational divide and there doesn't exist the same kind of consensus among Americans. The divestment movement again against the apartheid government, which started with universities and then was adopted by the US federal government, also arguably packed a bigger punch due to vulnerabilities in South Africa's economy, including the fact that many of its goods could be substituted with products from elsewhere. Okay, assuming that divesting from Israel would be possible, and some say it's not, the scholarship on such divestment movements' effectiveness is mixed. It would be very difficult to effectively boycott or ban imports of all Israeli goods, many of which do not have substitutes or at least would be hard to replace. That includes computer tech, medical devices, drugs, and advanced machinery in heavy industry. That doesn't necessarily mean that divestment from Israel would not have a significant impact on public perception of the war in Gaza and the Israel occupation. But the boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement, which predates the current protests, has so far had a negligible economic impact. The data suggests that economically, anything short of official sanctions by important economic partners such as the US or EU would be unlikely to produce anything near the kind of economic pressure BDS supporters envision, researchers at the Brookings Institute concluded. University administrators are now also facing pressure from donors, and politicians that didn't exist during the 1980s. At least 1 billion one sec. At least one billionaire donor has indicated that he intends to pull his support from Colombia amid the protests, and over 30 states have laws that preclude their government from doing business with companies that embrace the BDS movement against Israel. The call for the divestment of Israel has a lot of opposition because there's a lot of political power structure to support Israel, Cohen said. Why universities are breeding grounds for political activism. Breeding grounds? You say breeding grounds. Hashim said, I read a new book every week. Are you gloating, Hashim? We're a lot more chill than that. Come on now. There is something about a university campus that inspires political activism, even in the age of social media. Geographic proximity to a community with a high concentration of young people, many of whom are thinking critically about the world for the first time and may be undistracted by the pressures of adult life, seems to help incubate social movements. I don't know about that. I'm going to push back. Hang on a second. Let's just reread that. I feel as if that was a bit much. Like, I'm not with that take. Were you? I'm not feeling it. I'm not feeling it at all. I'm going back to it. Okay. There is something about university campus that inspires political activism. I don't necessarily think that equates to critical thinking. This is why. So it says, even in the age of social media, geographic proximity to a community with a high concentration of young people, many of whom are thinking critically. I don't believe they're thinking critically about the world for the first time, but they're not thinking. I don't think they are thinking critically because of the age of social media. They're not. They're just getting absorbed. Apparently, they're thinking critically for the first time and maybe undistracted by the pressures of adult life. I think adults who are not stuck to their phones are not undistracted. And I think those seems to help incubate. I think I think the I think that's I think it's the inverse. I don't believe that. I'm going to push back on that heavily, heavily. Um, Headwork says, I'm very proud of only having read 2 books in my life. I'm proud of the 10 books I've had on the go and not being able to complete one for a good few months. And sometimes I'll just do a couple of chapters and then I'm out. So yeah, headwork. Aristotle says LOL, and then Aristotle says university is a platform and a captive audience for people to get on their soapboxes. You're so right. You're so right. The university is a center of teaching and learning where people are taught in classes or out of classes to question things. This is wrong. This is so wrong, because the ones who are questioned start crying at their lecturers and their professors. Let's just be real about this, okay? If you are challenged at university, you think that you're a know-it-all these days, and you will basically just cry. Oh, gosh, I'm quite critical, aren't I? This isn't specific to America. All around the world, college campuses are hubs of political activity, and young people are at the forefront of social movements. It's, again, I'm going to be critical, because when you're living at a time when more than 50-60% of your time is spent on a screen, and you're not connecting with other humans, yet you find people are gathering together around a social cause, you find yourself in the mix, because you didn't join the badminton club, you didn't do the chess club, you didn't volunteer in the local community garden, because that wouldn't be cool, that wouldn't be fun. It's more cool to join students yelling and shouting. I'm just saying, okay? Even if they're yelling and shouting for something, legitimate, right? Headwork says, I never went to uni neither, not versatile enough. You would be wasted in university, okay? They would just try and make you into a clone, okay? Um, The authority says, how can I get started in politics? I know nothing. I think knowing nothing is really good, the authority, because then you can question more. So all your questions, you know how they say, no question is a dumb question. No, 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 don't. Like, definitely question. No, no, sorry. What am I saying? What am I saying? So I don't know. I clearly don't know what I'm saying. And that's politics for you. People don't know what they're talking about in politics. And you'll find a lot of people in positions of so-called representation um came from nowhere. They came from nowhere. Okay, so anyway, so let's come back to pushing back on this article about student protests, okay? But the more conservative elements of American society have never really wanted students to play that role. There was a persistent sense throughout major social movements in American history that young people were disrespecting their elders and the value of their education, with contemporary polls showing widespread disapproval of the sit-in movement against racial discrimination, the Freedom Riders, the free speech movement, and the anti-war movement of the 1960s. Even after the Kent State massacre, polling showed that the American public sympathized more with the National Guard troops who shot and killed protesters than with the protesters themselves, Johnson noted. Blanket condemnations of today's protests as inherently anti Semitic and disruptive to the university environment, even though protests have not occupied buildings or interrupted classes, would suggest little has changed. It's true that some students feel unsafe, and university administrators should be taking steps to address those concerns, but they are no longer starting with the presumption of protecting free speech. The pressure to suppress these demonstrations is quicker and more extreme than the case in any prior student movement. But if university administrators continue on this path, they might just see it backfire on them, just as before. All they're going to do is accelerate the anger and rage of more and more students. That's true, even those who are not directly involved. That's certainly what happened in the 60s. Oh, I got through it. That was like, I was like, I'm going to be here for a while reading this thing. I got through it. How awesome. I got through it.